Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, and I want to bring in someone who has been living inside the process for a long time. Someone who knows the tricks, knows the traps, and has spent nearly 2 decades fighting for patients and providers in one of the most complex specialties in all of healthcare. I'm joined today by Dina. We won't use her last name because we do have a long-standing joke that she's in the WITSEC program. She doesn't let us take pictures of her either, so I'm very lucky that I got to put her picture on this video.
Very.
Yes, very. She's a prior authorization specialist with over 18 years of experience. The majority of it was in interventional radiology. And if you're not familiar with IR, it's a specialty where procedures are incredibly complex, incredibly nuanced, and as we're going to talk about, frequently the target of one of the most frustrating denial categories in all of revenue cycle, which is called the investigational denial. So, welcome, Dina. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Let's just jump into it, shall we?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning because we do have listeners who are just brand new to prior authorization and they're brand new to revenue cycle. So let's think back of when you started, which is, I know, a while ago. But what do you wish that somebody had told you about the prior authorization process that you know now that is not actually what you thought prior authorization was when you started?
That is a great question, Heather. I think I'd have to say that an approved prior authorization does not mean guarantee of payment.
Okay, so explain that a little bit because I think that some people believe that, well, I have a prior authorization number. Why did this still not get paid?
And they do. I think they think that, along with not realizing that they could have lost their benefits.
Okay, so like for somebody who is new, like maybe a patient who doesn't understand, because we do have this channel for patients and for professionals, expound on that a little bit. Like how does a patient lose benefits?
It could be loss of job. It could be a premium not paid. So even though we check it when they're a new patient and they first come in and we verify eligibility, it does not mean that that has been maintained. So before
Okay.
their appointment, we should always be responsible to check their benefits again.
Okay. And obviously, I mean, I think that we have experienced many times where we try to say to patients, always tell us when you change your insurance, right? Because a lot of times as practice, administrators, we don't know when somebody's changed their insurance. So you might go down a path of doing an authorization for insurance that maybe was the secondary but used to be the primary because somebody got a new insurance. Does that happen often?
It happens more often than what you'd realize. And I believe patients don't even think to tell us that their insurance has changed. So it does need to become our responsibility to verify that.
Okay. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So pretty much just knowing that a prior authorization is not a guarantee.
It is not a guarantee. We still need to make sure we check their benefits, submit the claims on time, and do our part, work together as a team.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, you work in interventional radiology, which is not exactly where most people start because of how complex that specialty is. But the habits you build early matter regardless of like what specialty you're working in. So, what does a rock solid prior authorization submission look like? The kind that minimizes the chance of a denial before it even happens.
I would have to say a rock solid prior authorization submission hinges on precise clinical and knowing that payer's criteria. You need to work with your clinical staff to fine tune the clinical to include any criteria that will help in a positive and quick turnaround.
Okay, so for our newbies out there, how does one find the insurance criteria for a particular procedure you're trying to get authorized?
There are some insurances you can request it from, but it's also usually found on their website or you can find it online. And
Okay.
it will spell out what they're requiring as far as conservative measures or if there's certain sizes for the IR procedure. And that
Okay.
will help you meet that.
So pretty much you can go into an insurance website or request, and like if you're on the phone, you can say, "Can you send me the policy for that?" Or if you're on the website, you can type in a CPT code and be able to find a policy that tells you exclusions and all of that.
Yes, you can, and you should check it frequently. They will change them or update them from time to time, so it's always good to log back in or to, look on the website for their policies.
Okay, that's good to know too. Um, what documentation? I mean, you kind of talked a little bit about criteria. I mean, what documentation do you know oftentimes trips up the process of a prior authorization? Almost kind of like it kills the denial, but it kills the authorization before it even starts, so that you get denied.
Yeah, it's not always that the documentation isn't complete. It's just sometimes hard to read or understand. It's really good to outline your clinical, to follow along in their steps, to make sense as as it hits the nurse's desk. It just makes them more aware and able to line up your clinical with their policy.
Okay, you kind of touched a little bit on something that I think that a lot of people assume that when you're doing a prior authorization, that it's the doctor who's making the decision as to whether or not something gets approved. I think patients sometimes think that, well, my doctor told me I needed to have this, so this should be approved by my insurance. But also, what you're saying is that it's not even a doctor on the insurance side that's always making that decision. Kind of explain a little bit on that.
No, it's usually a doctor or a higher up medical staff that has defined the policy, but it's going to be a nurse or other type of clinical staff that will be reviewing it. And if they can look at your clinical against their policy and basically go check, 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 it is going to be much smoother and easier for them. I've actually had them comment before that they have appreciated the way our clinical is easy to read, easily defined, and just helps them out. It's not necessarily their specialty that they've ever
Okay.
even been in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important too for listeners to understand is that, the insurance companies, they have these, nurses and these providers who are oftentimes reviewing something that they didn't even go to school in. That's not where their career background is in. And so these policies is pretty much what guides them.
Exactly, especially when you're talking about interventional radiology. There's a lot of people, including medical staff, that are not familiar with the procedures.
Thank you. We talked earlier in the episode about insurance company medical policies, the clinical coverage guidelines that payers use to judge whether something's medically necessary. In your 18 years, how important has it been for your team to actually read those policies? And how often do you find that practices are actually submitting their prior authorizations without even looking at a payer's criteria?
Reading the insurance medical policies is the single most critical habit for preventing denials. Unfortunately, an overwhelming majority of practices submit authorizations blindly. They rely on generic provider notes instead of looking at the payer's criteria first.
That's
Re-
that seems like that would be coming from a practice manager standpoint, it seems like that would be very wasteful of your resources.
no, actually, reading the policy eliminates guesswork. The policies provide exact clinical prerequisites needed for approval. It will speed up approval time when the information is plainly provided. Blind submissions is actually a waste of labor.
Okay.
Yeah, staff spend hours, they're resubmitting the required documentation that actually never stood a chance.
So it's actually more efficient for the team to be reviewing those policies and making sure they understand the policies so that then they're not wasting time down the road of having to do resubmissions because of not doing it right.
Far more efficient, and I also found it to be less frustrating when I made sure our clinical had what it needed.
On the
It
front end.
on the front end, it's better to fix it on the front end before ever sending.
Okay, I'm glad you kinda said something about that because I think sometimes, administrators, especially newbies to prior auth, they get a little intimidated in having to approach a provider to say, I need better clinical or I need this added. So from your experience, I know that, once you've been doing it for a long time with the providers
Mhm.
that you've been with, you can kind of,
Yeah.
really go in there and just say, "Hey, I need this. Like what happened here?" type of thing. But when you're starting off, how do you approach a provider in a way to help them know that they're actually helping themselves by giving you, the prior auth specialist, what you need in the clinical?
No, I remember the days of being intimidated, like that I am talking down to the provider by saying your clinical isn't good enough. It's not that it isn't good enough, it's just that you have to explain to them, this is the policy. And if we don't spell that out in our clinical, we are just going to delay the patient's care. The patients are going to wait weeks. The staff's time, we have wasted. It's going to increase peer to peers. And we all know that providers do not like to do peer to peers.
Oh, they do not like to do peer-to-peers. I know when I hear that those get put on the schedule, it's like grumbling is is all I hear for maybe a good 10 minutes.
Yeah, big time. So just explaining those things that I'm just trying to make it easier and less frustrating for all of us. They may dig their heels in for a second, but usually they'll work with you if you know you're just trying to take care of the practice and the patient.
Great. Everybody's working on the same team, trying to accomplish the same thing. So let's talk about interventional radiology specifically, because I think that most people outside of healthcare, and honestly, a lot of people inside of healthcare, don't really understand what interventional radiology is and why it creates such a unique authorization challenge. Can you give our listeners a quick picture of what kinds of procedures you're authorizing and why the complexity is so much higher than maybe, requesting for a standard, imaging study such as like an MRI or a CT?
Okay, so interventional radiology uses advanced imaging to guide minimally invasive surgical treatments instead of like the traditional open operations. Because IR bridges diagnostic imaging and direct treatment, it involves incredibly complex procedures that create unique prior authorization nightmares compared to a standard imaging. A standard imaging study, like an MRI or CT, only answers diagnostic questions. It has a set protocol, one CPT code, maybe one diagnosis code. Where an IR procedure, they have fundamental treatments, which makes the authorization a little bit heavier.
Okay, so like, give me some examples of some conditions then I guess that you guys are getting into for treating.
Well, it's quite the specialty. As far as oncology goes, there is a procedure that's called a chemoembolization or radiofrequency or microwave ablation. It will destroy tumors directly at the source, kidney or liver or other areas.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it is. Vascular interventions, there's angioplasty, stent placement, there's arthrectomy that clears blocked arteries. And then they can do embolizations to stop internal bleeding. They can treat uterine fibroids. It starts to go into other, like pelvic congestion syndrome, where they can treat pelvic varices. There's just a wide array.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I always found fascinating about IR is that you never had just a typical day at the office. It wasn't a matter of that you're just going to see the same condition over and over again. There were so many things that we would do and so many things that the doctors could do for a vast variety of conditions. And so I guess one of my follow-up questions for you is that do you have to have a good understanding of coding in all of those specialties, or are there specific interventional codes that you work with that make the coding process easier for you, or do you really have to understand the coding for those different specialties?
Well, you definitely need to understand the coding, the CPT codes. There's only so many, but you still need to understand, what you're treating. So you need the CPT code that directly supports it, but you need the ICD-10 code line by line with the CPT that defines the symptoms, the anatomy, um, it's really good to give a 3-sentence summary explaining the patient's condition, what conservative measures failed, and exactly what your intended outcome is.
Okay, so you have to understand the ICD-10 codes, which we've talked about a little bit in previous videos and in this video too. But you do have specific IR. So one of the things, you just talked about is that you got to have the symptoms spelled out. You got to have a summary of what's going on. Are those kind of the things that you recommend to submit to a payer? Because as you've also talked about, that it's a nurse or a physician
Right,
who has no idea of the specialty that they're actually reviewing, and they've never seen the procedure that's being requested.
right.
And so are those things that you are recommending to help that process go through a little bit smoother?
Oh, yes, for sure. I mean, interventional radiology is complex. And so, in order to get a procedure approved by a general reviewer, you need to translate the clinical to them in a clear, like, undeniable story of medical necessity. You can't just simply submit a stack of medical records and hope that that reviewer can connect the dots. You need to connect them for them.
Makes sense. Okay. Okay, so here's one that I really want to dig into because it comes up constantly in IR, and it's one of the most maddening denials in revenue cycle: the investigational denial. The insurance company looks at the procedure, one that's being performed nationwide, one that your physicians have been doing for years, one that's become the standard of care. And they come back and they say, we considered this investigational. What is the insurance? What's actually happening? Like, what's the insurance saying there? What's going on? Why does that denial come through? And why does it happen so frequently in interventional radiology?
This is a tough one.
It is a tough one. That's why I want you to answer it, because I don't want to try to answer that one.
Okay. When an insurance company issues an investigational or experimental denial for an established interventional radiology procedure, it means they have determined the treatment lacks sufficient high quality clinical evidence to prove it improves the health outcome, what we're saying that it will do. In plain terms, the payer is claiming the procedure is still a science experiment and that it's not a standard of medical policy or practice. An investigational denial is rarely about the specific patient. It's a systemic policy-driven rejection happening at the corporate level.
Okay, so doesn't involve what's really going on with the patient. You're saying that they're saying that it's not considered the standard of care, even though maybe, you go to medical conferences and everyone is saying that this is the best way to treat a patient for this condition or said condition. Can you give us a specific condition where you often maybe see something like this happen with an insurance company, that some payers pay for that specific procedure for that condition, where other payers are saying that it's investigational?
Yes, unfortunately, and the procedure has been proven to have successful outcomes, and one of those would be what is called a pelvic venogram for pelvic congestion syndrome.
Can you tell people what pelvic congestion syndrome is? Like, just like a really quick, like short couple of sentences of what is pelvic congestion.
Well, it's the ovarian veins or a pelvic source where there is reflux. Um, Basically, you could say, well, ovarian vein. And it's where, sort of like a varicose vein, where they get a backup of blood that's not working the way it should. And they're able to go in and add coils, which will embolize that area, that just shuts it off so that the blood flow doesn't continue just to pool. Women can have pain from this, they can have heaviness, and the procedure has proven to be effective, but there are insurances who cover it and insurances who don't, which is very frustrating for the patient as well as the provider who knows that this is a solution.
Okay. So I'm just going to put you on the spot. When you get a denial, sometimes you don't know if an insurance is going to cover a procedure or not, especially with interventional radiology because things change so often with what can be done for a patient. And so what's your gut feeling? Like what is your gut response when you get a denial for investigational reasons?
Well, total frustration. I mean, I it's frustrating on many levels because first of all, you believe, you know that this is a help. And then second of all, you start to feel helpless in a way because overturning an investigational or experimental procedure can be next to impossible.
That was going to be my next question is that what, what is there, if anything, can a prior auth specialist or a practice do to even fight against an investigational denial?
Well, after getting over your frustration of it, you can pull articles from a peer-to-peer review. You can try to get information from journals or national clinical practice guidelines to try to do a letter of medical necessity that a physician can help you write up as well that
How often do
shows,
you see that work?
unfortunately, not as often as we would like. It would be nice if the insurance companies or those who are writing the policies would look back into things and see that it's not just a science experiment, that they would look at the evidence that shows how effective or helpful this procedure can be.
Oh, that's even something that I was going to ask, and maybe I'll ask it now because I don't know if I'm going to ask it later. But how often do you see these insurances reviewing their policies and making changes where their policy has been listed as investigational for years and years and years? And do you ever really see them make a change where something now is not considered investigational?
I can't say that I haven't seen it happen for the positive. I have seen insurance companies actually start to cover it. They may have different requirements than other insurances that need to be met, like defining the size of the ovarian vein or saying that it's pelvic congestion, that's seen and proven by a CT or something like that. But there are other companies who are just, in my personal opinion, who don't even consider looking into whether this is a helpful procedure or not.
Okay, so pretty much some of them are shut down just automatically, but basically because you have seen some positive, there's maybe some rays of hope that don't give up necessarily when you get an investigational denial as setting that as your standard for that payer for years and years to come. You're saying that sometimes they will make a change to their policy.
Oh, yeah, I think so, for sure. And that's why from time to time, it's always good not only to look at the policies again, but to submit. You never know what changes could have happened that you're not even aware of yet. And so, even though you know it's a payer who may not cover, it's always best to submit. And, a patient can always jump in too.
How do you recommend patients to jump in and help?
You know, I have said for a long time that the patient's voice is key, especially once something has been denied. We look as providers who are just maybe wanting the financial component of it, which isn't true. We believe the doctors believe in what they're doing and they are helpful, but a patient, it's their insurance and they need to write letters or call and hound. It's affecting them and they need to hear from the insurance company how it's affecting and hopefully get them to open up and look at, relooking at these procedures.
Right. Patients are their best advocates for themselves with their
Yes,
insurance.
and I wish that they understood that, but it's very scary.
It's intimidating.
Yeah, very intimidating. Even for those who do it for a while, it can be intimidating, but all they need to do is explain how they're hurting or how that they want their life to improve.
Quality of life is huge.
Yeah.
We talked about peer-to-peer reviews a little bit earlier and how physicians just really love doing those. I think that's like the highlight of their day, to get on the phone and talk to the insurance company. And really what a peer-to-peer is the doctor going on and arguing for the patient on the patient's behalf with your insurance. So where, in your specialty where they're, very specialized, we can make it be very specific to interventional radiology, but honestly, peer-to-peers, are handled the same way no matter what specialty you're in. So how do you prepare a physician for a call? What do you wish your more physicians understood about how to make a peer-to-peer as effective as possible?
Okay, well, first of all, if anyone missed your sarcasm in there, yeah, the doctors, the providers, whomever it is, they do not like peer-to-peer reviews. So it is best not to let them go in blind. You need to give them a one-page battle sheet.
Battle sheet. I love that. Battle sheet.
Battle sheet. Yeah, give them bullet points. What's missing? What could you have possibly even given in the clinical that got skipped in the review that you feel is necessary to discuss? It could also be that we left off the prior failed conservative treatment. That got skipped, we're not always perfect. So it's just discussing that, or the sizes of the fibroid or the sizes of the ovarian veins.
Something specific to the condition that makes it so that it's not, that it's not a matter of that it's we're just asking for this because we think it's going to
Yeah,
work. It's a matter of you're having that doctor talk about how clinically he feels that this is the right thing.
right. Just saying that the patient really needs this or this isn't fair. That's not going to work. So,
Well, it isn't fair.
no,
It
no,
isn't fair.
no,
So
it isn't fair. And I wish that worked, but you need to point out the reasons that it's medically necessary and that the conservative treatments failed. You have to get the clinical to support it and meet the policy.
have you ever been listening on a peer-to-peer call where you can tell that the physician on the insurance side really truly doesn't understand or grasp what procedure or what conditions truly being treated, and so that your provider, your doctor has almost had to educate the physician on the insurance side as to why this is appropriate care for the patient?
With IR procedures, yes, I have heard. And that, I get it. It can be confusing. And so the provider does need to educate and explain how maybe they weren't understanding the clinical and that, we're just helping them understand and take care and resolve the issue.
Do you feel like peer-to-peers are successful? Do you feel like that they work?
Yes, yes, peer-to-peers definitely work, especially if we have fallen short with the clinical. It's a way to get on the phone and say, okay, this is what we meant. You usually need to update the clinical and resend it in again if you've missed something. But yeah, having a good dialogue, um, especially if it's meeting their policy, they're very successful.
Great. Thank you. Now, I want to ask you something specifically for people who listening have been in revenue cycle for maybe 5, 10, 15 years, and they think that they've seen it all. What is something you do or something that you have figured out that most people in your role aren't doing? Like, what is that thing that makes your process different?
I've learned over time to listen to the customer service or the nurse that you're talking with at the insurance or dealing with. And if you don't feel that they're at the level you need to be, don't be afraid to ask for a manager or continue to escalate it up the line. And also don't worry about ending a call and trying over again. Recall and see if you can get someone new, someone who's willing to discuss the case and see your reasoning behind sending it back for an additional review.
So basically you're saying don't just take that initial, denial or that call that person now is made to you saying, "Well, this is about now been denied," and you start asking questions because you knowing what you've submitted, everything met their criteria and you're not understanding why the denial even happened. You're saying basically don't just take that at face value.
No, especially since it can be complex. Plus, a lot of times they're just wanting you off of the phone. So I learned over the years that it's always best to start with honey. And if you have to end up with vinegar, then that's what happens.
I love it. And I do know you start with honey, but I'll give every listener on here a little tidbit that we used to call Dina our pit bull. We knew that she could get through to what she needed to, and she never gave up on anything. So we would always use her as an example of what to do. But she always did train all of our people to start with honey
Yes,
before getting to the vinegar.
it's always best to start it out well, but you also want to fight for the patient.
Let's talk about tracking and patterns because I think one of the things that separates a good authorization team from a great one is how they use their own data. What do you guys track? What do you use your data to that helps that has helped you over the years make changes or how you approach certain payers or certain procedure types?
Well, tracking payers who say no prior authorization is required is important to know
Oh, that's a
because,
huge one.
yeah, they could, when they say no prior authorization required, means that they'll review the clinical at the time of a claim, which could still end up in a denial. And so knowing that they may do a predetermination on the front end where they will look at the clinical before the procedure is completed, which sounds just like a prior authorization. I don't
I
know
was
why
going to say,
insurances do that.
we kind of go into that a little bit in this episode of kind of talking about the difference of the two, but just in a nutshell, what is the difference between a prior authorization and a predetermination?
In my opinion, the only real difference is the length of time. I believe an insurance company who's saying no prior authorization required, they are leaving it up to you to know the clinical and whether that this is a possibly approved. Um, you definitely want to do a predetermination with those, especially if you're unsure of the insurance
So
company.
what you're saying though is that a prior authorization and a predetermination still does not guarantee payment.
No, no, it does not. Um, you're still trusting in the sense that somebody has reviewed it correctly instead of a lot of times still getting the clinical and saying, okay, no predetermination required either. It is necessary for you to know their policy and let the patient know at that time that, there's a huge risk for all in not being covered.
If you have a predetermination on file, have you seen that if they do come back and deny payment, have you seen that having the predetermination does help overturn that denial?
Yes, if you have a predetermination on file, you can go back and say this was reviewed. Once again, there's never guarantees with insurance companies and claims, but it definitely helps support the fact that they did review the clinical.
How often do you get a response back when doing a predetermination that when you called and they said, yes, these are all covered codes for this procedure, and but they don't offer an authorization for it, but you requested a predetermination? How often have you then had a predetermination come back saying that actually this is not going to be a covered procedure for this patient for this condition with those codes?
It happens quite a bit, especially when we talked earlier about those investigational procedures. They will still come back as denied, and it's best to have that predetermination on file, um, just to, let the patient know and be no surprises. So, yeah, predeterminations can still get denied.
Okay, thank you for that. What other things like do you worry about tracking.
Yeah, it's good to track, policies as far as the conservative measures so you can let the patients know in advance that maybe it's not best we put you on the schedule right now, that there's a few things you need to do first. So it's always good to track those and then keep your practice managers aware of any changes with those policies. That will help when they're meeting with the payers for contract negotiations and when they're doing provider relation discussions.
I love that. Thank you.
Mhm.
I always want to bring it back to the patient because at the end of the day, that's who this affects the most. In your experience, what do patients not understand about what's happening behind the scenes when their authorization is being processed? And what do you wish you could tell every patient before their procedure?
Well, I wish I could tell them that the decision, the denial, it's not a medical verdict. I think patients, they hear that the procedure was denied for whatever reason, whether it was investigational or they're not meeting the criteria fully, they will internalize that and they'll think that, well, my doctor is wrong or this procedure is not necessary, that they don't need it, or they're thinking that the prior authorization specialist doesn't care enough or that they did something wrong with their authorization. And what they don't realize is it's a generic corporate checkbox failure. They're trying to do the delay
The
tactic.
delay of care.
Delay of care. And so they're intentionally trying to stretch it out or frustrate, you know, either the provider or the patient and hoping that someone gives up and abandons care.
I think that, like, you're just touching on that, right? Is that they're planning on somebody giving up, right? Like that the
Yes.
automatic denial, that might not be like the final decision, but it's a tactic to get somebody to maybe give up on that trajectory of care that they were pursuing. And so it saves the insurance a little bit of money on that side of things. So with that, can you tell me, have you ever had a case where a patient's own advocacy, like where they called their insurance, where they asked questions, where they pushed back with their insurance on their own, actually changed the outcome?
Yes, I have seen it. We actually had a patient at one point who took their denial and fought their insurance company. They spoke up, and it actually opened care for other patients. They were actually willing to discuss the procedure and the benefits of it on this patient, and they didn't only approve it for them, but they were willing to rewrite their policy to, include the procedure. So it is helpful.
So patients still have a voice with some of these situations. Some payers will listen. We can't guarantee always, but it's not just we're saying don't always just give up.
No, don't always give up. They have the loudest voice. It's best for them to advocate for themselves.
Great. Last question. I know it's been a rough one. So thank you so much for your patience and sticking with me through this whole interview. I want you to be honest here. After 18 years of doing this work, watching this system from the inside, do you think that prior authorization is getting better? Do you think it's getting worse or just getting different? And what gives you hope, if anything?
So, for being completely honest, I don't necessarily think prior authorization is getting better. It's getting intensely different.
What do you mean by that?
Well, with the high volumes and the battleground has completely shifted. We've moved away from faxing and communicating, with customer service. We've entered a more fast-paced era of digital automated warfare.
Yeah, you're
It's
not talking to a person.
right. It's artificial intelligence, and they'll run their algorithms, and it can go into an instant denial. When they're reviewing, when AI is reviewing, if with their scans, if things aren't spelled out, specific keywords, they could issue an automatic denial in a
So you're
fraction of a
saying that
second.
honestly, people could see more denials possibly come
Yes.
through because of maybe not having the the clinical in line with what needs to be submitted.
Yes, and that's where it's going to be harder and not necessarily better because it's all the more pressure to make sure that your clinical is bulletproof. That in that scan with AI, it can pick up all of the key points from their policy.
So it's sounding like you're not necessarily a fan of AI in the prior authorization world. Is that true? Is
Well,
that false?
no, that it's double-edged sword there. It can deny claims really quickly or prior authorizations really quickly, but it also could trigger a real-time automated approval within seconds if everything is lining up and the clinical is matching the data, then it can all come together to make a smoother process.
So what gives you hope then, if anything?
I just think offices will just need to track their data better. They'll need to follow the policies closely, and they'll just need to learn to evolve with this changing process.
Okay. Wow. Well, thank you. This has
Mhm.
been one of the most valuable conversations I think that we've had on this channel. I want to thank you for pulling back the curtain on what this work actually looks like, the strategy, the grinding detail, the advocacy, and honestly, the passion it takes to do this for as long as you have for 18 years. So it's obvious that, it's obvious to me that you care about the providers you work for, but you also care about the patients and you want to see what's best for both to come through. So thank you for sharing your experiences with us. For everyone listening, the kind of expertise she just shared with you is not common. It is built over years of denials fought, appeals written, peer-to-peers navigated, and patients protected. If you're building a revenue cycle team, this is a standard you're aiming for. If you want to hear the full conversation, the link is in the description and the comments below.